I met Orvanketh on a Tuesday in the 4th month of my 31st year with the Federation Land Assessment Corps. I remember the day of the week because I had filed the wrong transit form that morning and had to refile it by hand, which put me 2 hours behind schedule, which meant I arrived at the Kethosaset Highland Plateau in the late afternoon rather than at noon, and the light was already going amber and long when I came through the estate's outer gate and found a very tall alien standing in the middle of his own access road with his arms folded, waiting. He had been waiting, I later learned, since noon. I apologized. He studied me for a long moment with those pale amber eyes. The Velketh have irises the color of old honey, ringed with a thin line of silver, and when they focus on you it feels less like being looked at and more like being measured against something. And then he said, in very good Federation standard with only the faintest trace of a highland accent, that he had been told the human assessors were efficient. I told him I had filed the wrong transit form. He considered this. Then he turned and walked back toward the estate house, and he said over his shoulder that I had better come in for something to eat before the light went, since I would not be able to finish the primary assessment in the dark, and he did not like the idea of a guest working through dinner. That was the beginning of it. I should say something about what Orvanketh looked like, because I have noticed that when I tell this story people picture him wrong. They picture a Velketh elder robed, formal, the kind of ceremonially important figure who arrives with an entourage and speaks in the cadences of hereditary rank. That was not him. He was tall, the way all Velketh are tall, built with that quality of compressed patience in the frame, as if his body had learned to conserve itself over a very long life. His skin was the deep blue-gray of weathered highland stone. His hair had gone completely white sometime in his middle decades, which he wore pulled back with a length of plain cord. He dressed in the heavy dark cloth that the plateau farmers wear, practical and without ornament, and his hands were the hands of someone who worked the land himself rather than directing others to do it. He was, in other words, exactly what he appeared to be, a highland landowner who grew Velketh grain in the short plateau seasons, kept a small herd of the four-legged grazing animals whose name I can still not pronounce correctly, and asked questions about everything. That last quality was the thing I did not expect. The assessment took 3 days. Standard procedure for an estate of Kethosaset size. I walked the field lines, logged the soil tier classifications, ran the water rights cross-checks against the regional registry, cataloged the structures. The Corps provided a room in the estate's west wing. Meals were at a long stone table in the main hall, and Orvanketh ate with me, not to be polite, because he wanted to talk. He asked about Earth, not in the way most aliens ask about Earth, not the grand geography, not the old wars, not the technological progression narrative that most species find reassuring to run through because it makes humans feel predictably categorizable. He asked about smaller things. He asked whether it was true that humans had a strong instinct for seasonal rhythm even when living without seasons. He asked what it felt like to grow up in a place where you could see the horizon in every direction without interruption. He asked whether it was hard to leave. I told him I had grown up in a mid-sized city and had never much noticed the horizon. He found this genuinely interesting. He said that the Velketh, as a people, had a phrase for someone who did not notice the horizon of their home ground, and that the phrase translated approximately as someone who would be comfortable anywhere, and that this was considered a rare and slightly enviable quality. On the 3rd day, when I was finishing the water rights documentation in the estate study, his daughter came into the room. She was small even by Velketh child standards, which is to say she came up to just below my elbow, and she had her father's white hair and her mother's coloring, a pale lavender, almost silver in the bright highland morning light that came through the study window. She had the oversized amber eyes of a young Velketh child and her father's quality of watchful attention, though in her it came out as a kind of stillness, rather than a habit of question asking. She stood in the doorway and looked at me for a long time, and then looked at the survey charts on the table, and then looked at me again. I said hello. She did not reply. She looked at the charts again. I asked her if she wanted to look at them. She came to the table and stood beside me and examined the charts with the focused attention of someone reading a significant document. She was perhaps 6 or 7 seasons old, which translated to approximately 9 or 10 Federation Standard years. She pointed at the water rights cross-reference grid and asked what the numbers in the third column meant. I explained the third column. She listened with her father's quality of complete and unself-conscious attention, and then she asked a follow-up question that was, I noted privately, better than the follow-up question most adult clients asked. I answered it. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and then she left the room without another word. That evening, Orvanketh told me that Sovalal did not generally speak to people she had just met. He said it with a quality that I came to understand over the years that followed, was how the Velketh expressed quiet pride, a slight forward inclination of the head, a softening around the eyes. I submitted my assessment the following morning and drove back down the plateau road. Standard procedure. I thought about the estate occasionally over the next season, the way you think about work that was satisfying and clean. I did not expect to go back. The following year's reassessment cycle rotated back to Kethosset. My supervisor asked me, as a professional courtesy, whether I had any preference for which estates I reassessed. I said the Velketh Highland holdings were fine. The reassessment of Orvanketh's estate took 4 days. The extra day was because we talked through most of the first afternoon, and the work ran late. That became the pattern. Over the next 11 years, I reassessed Kethosset's Highland Plateau holdings every Federation calendar year. I was not always assigned to the same estates. The Corps rotated its assessors for consistency-checking purposes, but I always put in for the Velketh Highland assignments, and my supervisor, who was a practical woman with no interest in paperwork arguments, gave them to me without comment. 11 years. It is a long time, and it is not, depending on what happened inside it. What happened was this. I came to know Orvanketh's estate in the way you come to know a piece of ground when you walk it season after season, not as a catalog of features, but as a living thing with its own habits and rhythms and year-to-year changes. I knew which field lines shifted after the wet season. I knew where the upper herd preferred to water in the dry months. I knew the particular quality of light on the plateau at mid-morning in the 4th month, the way it hit the old quarried stone of the estate house and turned it the color of warm ash. And I knew that Orvanketh would be at the stone table in the main hall with 2 cups of the dark Velketh grain tea when I came through the door, because he had established this habit in the 2nd year and never varied it. He did not always remember to ask before making it in the early seasons. He simply had it there, as if there was no reasonable question about whether I would want it. And somewhere around the 4th year, I stopped noticing that he had not asked, because the tea was always the right thing when I came off the plateau road in the early afternoon. That is the kind of small accumulation that becomes something, without either person deciding it should. I also came to know his wife. Varketh Isan was not from the Highland clans. She was from the coastal settlement at Velocitev, which gave her a different coloring. Her skin was a deeper lavender than Sovalal's, almost violet in certain lights, and a certain directness of manner that the Highland Velketh tended to find disconcerting. She had opinions about everything and expressed them clearly, and did not soften them for the benefit of an audience. I liked her immediately. She liked me, I think, in the measured way that sensible people like someone they are still assessing, which is to say that for the first 3 years she was cordial and precise, and did not bother pretending either more warmth or more distance than she felt. The 4th year she told me, over dinner, that she had looked up my assessment record in the Public Federation Registry, and found it unusually consistent for a 12-year career. I said I tried to be thorough. She said thoroughness was common enough, but consistency over time was harder and rarer, because it required a person to resist the temptation to simplify what they already knew. She said she had noticed I did not simplify what I already knew about Kethosaset's soil tier classifications, even when the simplification would have saved me 2 hours of field work, and she wanted to say that she had noticed this. That was, I understood, Varketh Isan's version of a significant compliment. I thanked her. She poured more tea and changed the subject. But something had shifted, in the quiet way things shift when a person decides they have enough evidence for a preliminary conclusion. She was more willing, in the years after that conversation, to tell me things she had previously kept in the household domain. Not the finances. She kept those close for another 2 years, but the daily texture of the estate. Which of the estate staff were reliable and which required watching, which of the highland neighbors could be trusted in a dispute, and which had a long-standing interest in the water rights boundary on the eastern edge. How the plateau winter had been in years, I was not there to see it. She was giving me a map. I understood that later. Sauval, over those 11 years, grew from a silent and watchful 7-year-old into a silent and watchful teenager. And then, in the last 3 years before everything changed, into a young adult who was neither silent nor particularly watchful, but who had inherited her father's quality of asking questions that were better than the ones you expected. She had taken an interest in Federation land law, which she studied through the Compact Educational Exchange, and she and I spent a good part of the 9th year arguing about the application of water rights precedent to highland plateau estates, which was a niche disagreement, and one I was not certain I won. In the 10th year she won it clearly and told me so without particular triumph, which I thought showed character. I say all of this not to make the story feel larger than it was, but because I want to be clear about what the friendship actually was. It was not a grand thing. There were no dramatic moments of crisis or rescue. We ate meals together and walked field lines together and talked about the things that interested each of us. And over 11 years, those conversations accumulated into something that I would have had difficulty naming at the time, but which I understood the weight of in the season after Orvanketh died. He died in the 14th month of my 42nd year with the Corps. A circulatory event, the medical record said, which is a clean phrase for something that is not clean. He had been healthy. He had given no particular indication of what was coming. He was 73 Federation standard years old, which was not old for a Velketh, and he had been in the middle of planning the following season's planting rotation when it happened. I arrived for the annual assessment 3 days later and found the estate staff waiting at the outer gate. They were not waiting for me specifically. They were gathered at the gate because the estate was now in a state that the Velketh call Velasan, a kind of formal suspension, a held breath between the death of a household head and the legal resolution of what follows, and the protocol for Velasan is that the household staff maintains the outer boundary until the inheritance matter is settled. They had been there since the morning Orvanketh died. They would remain there until the succession council issued its ruling. The estate manager, a compact gray-skinned Velketh man named Oravel who had managed the property for 30 years, told me this in the flat tone of someone reciting a procedure they had run before and did not much want to run again. He also told me that Varketh Isan had asked him to let me in if I arrived. I went in. Varketh Isan was in the main hall, not at the stone table. She was standing at the window that looked out over the upper fields, and she did not turn when I came in, but she said my name. She said it in the way the Velketh use a person's name when they are acknowledging presence rather than beginning a conversation, which is a slight tonal difference that I had learned to recognize around the 7th year. I said I was sorry. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the plateau light was doing what it always did at that hour, going that amber-and-dash color, long and level across the fields, and I stood in the hall and waited, because waiting was clearly what was needed. I had gotten better at that over the years, at staying in a room without filling it. She said, "He registered the deed 8 months ago." I did not know what that meant yet. She turned from the window, and I saw that she had been crying, which the Velketh do with a characteristic suppression. The eyes go glassy and red-rimmed, but the face holds its shape, as if the emotion is something they are containing rather than expressing, and it gives the impression of someone carrying something heavy in a formal procession. She looked in that moment like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for 3 days and had made the internal decision to keep carrying it. She was also, I noticed, holding herself with a quality of deliberate steadiness, as if she had rehearsed this conversation because she knew it needed to go a specific way, and she did not intend to let grief unsettle the delivery. She said, "He updated his land registration with the compact registry. The deed to the estate, the grain holding contract, the livestock rights, the water rights allocation, the estate accounts, all of it. He transferred beneficial ownership to you 8 months ago and registered the transfer with 2 witnesses, and I was one of the witnesses." I looked at her. She said, "I know you did not ask for it." She said, "He told me he had thought about it for a long time, and that when he thought about who he trusted most with the things he had built here, your name came first, and he was not confused about why. He said you were the only person who had ever come to this plateau 11 times and left it still interested in it. He said that was a harder quality to find than he had expected when he began looking." She reached into the heavy cloth of her jacket and produced a scroll. Not a datapad, not a file transfer receipt. A scroll, the old kind, heavy pressed leaf paper the color of old cream, rolled and sealed with the estate's registration mark. She held it out. I took it. The paper was heavy in my hands. I held it for a moment without opening it. Then I unrolled it and found the deed written in Orvanketh's own hand. The long, careful strokes of Highland Velketh script, which I could read perhaps 40% of after 11 years of looking at estate documents. And at the bottom right corner, in the space the registration format required for the recipient's name, he had written my name, not in Federation standard. In Velketh Highland script, phonetically rendered, the way a careful person writes something they have thought about rather than simply transliterated. The ink was slightly blotched where the pen had pressed harder, as if the hand writing it had paused a moment before committing. I could not speak for a moment. Varketh Isan said, "The council will come, you should know that." I asked when. She said they would come within a week of the Velasan notification, which the estate manager had filed 2 days ago. She said they would challenge the deed on the grounds of clan bond land law, which held that Velketh hereditary agricultural estates could only transfer to Velketh clan members or to compact registered household members of Velketh lineage. She said she and Orvanketh had anticipated this argument and had prepared for it, and that she would tell me what she knew, but that she wanted me to understand first that she was not asking me to fight for this. She said, "If it is too much, you can decline the deed. The law allows a registered recipient to decline within 30 days of the Velasan notification." I asked her if she and Sovalal would be all right if I declined. She said, "No, but that is not a reason to make this your burden if you do not want it." I looked at the deed. I looked at my name in the lower right corner in Orvanketh's careful hand, the ink slightly blotched where he had pressed hard. I said, "I'm not declining anything." Varketh Isan looked at me for a long moment with those violet dark eyes. Then she nodded once, the way her husband used to nod when he had confirmed something he had already suspected. She said, "Good, now I will tell you what you need to know." Over the 3 days that followed, she told me the full picture of what Orvanketh had done and why. He had spent the last 4 years reading compact property law in the evenings. She said this matter-of-factly, as if it were an obvious thing for a Highland farmer to do with his evenings, and I suppose for him it had been. He was the kind of person who treated legal instruments the way he treated everything else, as things worth understanding from the foundation rather than from the summary. He had identified Article 22, Provision 11 of the Compact Accord. He had read the case history on it. He had found 6 previous rulings where the provision had been applied in succession disputes, and he had read all 6. He had then arranged the deed transfer and the witness registration with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was building and what it needed to withstand. He had told no one except Varketh Isan. He had asked her to witness the filing. She had read the provision herself before agreeing. Then she had signed. The Velketh Succession Council arrived on a bright morning 6 days after the Velasan filing. 5 of them, in a ground transport with the council's mark on the side, a compact formal vehicle, dusk gray on the plateau road, its windows reflecting the morning light off the upper fields. They were not the kind of people who arrived with visible arrogance. They were the kind of people who arrived with visible certainty, which is a different and considerably more difficult thing to answer. Their lead assessor was a woman named Vethketh Oron, who carried herself with the calm of someone who had done this particular task many times and had not yet found a case she could not close. They came to the main hall. Varketh Isan received them. I stood to one side and said nothing. Vethketh Oron looked at me with a brief professional attention, the way you look at a complication you have already factored into your calculation, and then she addressed Varketh Isan. She was courteous. The Velketh, in my experience, are almost always courteous when they are certain of an outcome, because they can afford to be. She said the council was here to facilitate the Velasan resolution process, that the estate had entered a legally indeterminate status, and that the council's mandate was to ensure the inheritance transferred in accordance with clan bond land law. She said the deed that had been registered with the compact registry was not in dispute as a document. It was in dispute as a valid transfer instrument, because the recipient did not meet the clan bond land law criteria. She said this with the quality of someone reading out a technical finding rather than making an accusation, which is the style the council used, and which I had been warned about. It is a useful style if you want to prevent the person across the table from having anything clear to push against. Varketh Isan said, the deed was registered under compact law, not under clan bond land law. Vethketh Oron said, clan bond land law and compact law both apply to Velketh hereditary agricultural estates. In cases of conflict, the older instrument governs. Varketh Isan said, we are aware. There was a pause. Vethketh Oron let it sit, which is a technique, the deliberate silence that invites the other side to fill it with something they didn't mean to say. Neither of us filled it. After 7 seconds she continued. Vethketh Oron said, the council's reading of the applicable instruments is that the deed is unenforceable. The estate will revert to the clan bond inheritance line. She said this still in the same tone, factual, unhurried, certain. Behind her, the 4 other council members had the look of people who had come along to witness the resolution of something that was already resolved. I asked who the clan bond inheritance line was. Vethketh Oron looked at me with the specific quality of patience that very practiced professionals deploy when they are about to explain something to someone who is going to have difficulty understanding it. She said, the estate's clan bond inheritance line runs through the Velketh Highland senior lineage, specifically to the Kethosaset territorial branch, which has a registered standing claim under the pre-compact land covenant. I said, and Varketh Isan and her daughter. Vethketh Oron said, Varketh Isan holds a consort position, which carries residential rights but not ownership rights under clan bond land law. The daughter holds the same status under the consort lineage classification. She said this without inflection. It was the most straightforward version of what the territorial branch wanted, stated plainly, because there was no reason not to be plain. The widow and the child had rights of residence, nothing more, and those rights were tied to the goodwill of whatever heir the territorial branch installed. It was a clean legal instrument and an ugly outcome, and the fact that Vethketh Oron delivered it calmly did not change what it was. I understood then what Orvanketh had understood 8 months ago when he registered the deed. He had known this argument was coming. He had known the council would arrive, and he had known exactly what they would say, because the clan bond land law argument was the only instrument they had, and it was, on its surface, a reasonable one. A Velketh hereditary agricultural estate could not simply be transferred to an off-world human assessor. The law did not recognize it. The territorial branch had a standing claim. The math was straightforward. He had also known something about compact law that I did not know until Varketh Isan spent those 3 days explaining it to me. I asked Vethketh Oron, "Is there any provision in the clan bond land law for what happens when the deed transfer has been ratified by a registered household witness?" She said, "The consort position does not carry ratification authority under clan bond land law." I said, "I'm not asking about clan bond land law. I am asking about Compact Accord Article 22, Provision 11, which governs registered deed transfers on compact member worlds, when the transfer is witnessed by a household member with compact residency standing." Vethketh Oron stopped. The Compact Accord was older than the clan bond land law. Not much older, but older. And Article 22, Provision 11 was not an obscure provision. It was a core instrument of the Compact's approach to property transfer on member worlds, written specifically to prevent exactly the kind of post-death succession challenge that the Council was currently attempting. The provision held that a deed transfer registered with the Compact Registry and witnessed by a household member holding compact residency standing was irrevocable and superseded local succession instruments in cases of conflict. Varketh Isan held compact residency standing. She had held it since her marriage registration, which had been filed with the Compact Registry, not just the Clan Bond Registry, but the Compact Registry, 23 years ago. She had been one of the 2 witnesses on the deed. The other witness had been Oravel, the estate manager, who also held compact residency standing through his 30-year employment registration. Orvanketh had not left things to chance. He had thought about the law carefully, over a long time, and he had found the instrument that could not be undone, and he had used it with exactly the kind of quiet thoroughness that I recognized as his. And when he had needed 2 witnesses, he had chosen the 2 people in his household who were in the right legal position to make the thing stick. He had also registered the deed 8 months before his death, not in the weeks before it, which put the filing well outside any window that could be challenged on grounds of diminished capacity or undue influence. He had thought of everything. He had thought of everything and told almost no one, because he was not the kind of person who needed to explain his decisions in advance. He just made them carefully and registered them where they would hold. Vethketh Oron said nothing for a long time. I said, "I have the deed. It is registered with the Compact Registry under case reference number Velketh 7Asaset 0093T. You are welcome to pull the registration record. The witness documentation is part of the filing." She was still quiet. The 4 council members behind her had the look of people who had come to witness the resolution of something that had just stopped being resolved. Vethketh Oron said, "There may be grounds for a review of the registration process." I said, "The review period for Article 22 registered transfers is 14 days from the filing date. The filing date was 8 months ago." Varketh Isan, who had been standing to my left with her hands at her sides and her face composed, said, "My husband knew what he was doing. I want you to understand that clearly." Vethketh Oron looked at her. Varketh Isan said. He was not confused and he was not pressured, and he did not file that deed without knowing exactly what it meant. I witnessed it because I agreed with every word of it. If you want to challenge that in a compact tribunal, the compact tribunal will find that I hold valid compact residency standing, that I witnessed with full legal capacity, and that the filing is clean. You can spend 18 months and a considerable amount of the territorial branch's resources on that challenge. I will tell you now that I am prepared to testify for as long as it takes. There was a silence in the main hall. Outside, the plateau light had gone to the high clear light of late morning, flat and brilliant on the old quarried stone. Vethketh Oran said, "The council will need to consult." She said it in a tone that was still technically certain, but from which some of the certainty had drained. They left. They did not come back. I stood in the main hall after the sound of the transport had faded down the plateau road, and I did not move for a long moment. Varketh Isan stood beside me. After a while she went to the stone table and sat down, and I sat across from her, and neither of us said anything for a considerable time. She said, eventually, he spent 4 evenings reading case law on that provision. He read it until he was certain, and then he waited another 2 months and read it again. I said, "Why 2 months?" She said, he wanted to make sure he hadn't read it the way he wanted it to say. He was cautious about that, about the gap between what a document meant and what you hoped it meant. He said it was a more common error than people admitted. I said, "That sounds like him." She said yes. She poured 2 cups of the dark grain tea from the pot she had made before the council arrived, set one in front of me, and looked out the window at the fields. I learned later, through the compact registry's notification system, that the territorial branch filed a preliminary review request with the compact tribunal 7 days after the council's visit, and that the tribunal dismissed the request in summary proceedings, citing the Article 22 review window expiry. The dismissal was issued in standard form, 6 lines, the way the tribunal handled matters that were not close questions. The territorial branch filed no further challenge. What happened after that was quieter and in some ways harder. I was not a landowner. I had been a Federation assessor for 42 years, and I was comfortable with land as something I cataloged, not something I held. I understood the soil tier classifications of Orvanketh's highland estate with the professional accuracy of a man who had walked those fields 11 times. I did not know how to run them. I asked Oravel if he would stay on as estate manager. He said yes, with a quality of relieved dignity that told me the question had cost him something to wait for. I said I intended to continue the estate's existing operations without changes to staffing or practice, and that I would need to learn what I did not know, and that I was going to be an inconvenient student because I would ask questions about everything. He said, "You already know more about these fields than you think you do." I said, "I know the assessment record." That is not the same as knowing how to keep a herd watered through a dry season. He said, "It is closer than you would expect." He was right, which I did not fully understand until the first full season I spent on the estate. The Corps had trained me to read land in a way that turned out to translate, imperfectly but usefully, to understanding what the land needed. I made mistakes. Some of the mistakes were expensive. The Eastern Water Channel backed up in the 6th week, because I had not understood that the seasonal valve sequence needed to be run in a different order in dry years than in wet ones, and we lost 4 days of irrigation to the fix. A section of the northern field line markers had to be reset because I had relied on the previous season's digital record rather than walking the line fresh, which Oravel had told me to do, and which I had not done because I had thought I understood the terrain well enough from 11 years of assessment visits. I had not. Assessment visits and ownership are different kinds of attention, and it took me that whole first season to understand the difference. None of the mistakes were catastrophic, because Oravel had 30 years of knowledge that corrected most of the expensive ones before they became catastrophic, and because Varketh Isan had a complete and unsentimental understanding of the estate's finances and was willing to explain them to me with the directness she brought to everything. The two of us arrived over the first year at a working arrangement that was not quite a partnership in the formal sense, but was something close to it in the practical one. She ran the household and the accounts. I ran the field operations with Oravel's guidance. We ate dinner together most evenings at the stone table in the main hall, and we talked about the things that needed talking about, and sometimes we talked about Orvanketh, and those conversations were harder and quieter, but I think they were necessary. She had a way of describing him that was precise and without sentimentality, not because she had not loved him, but because she was constitutionally allergic to imprecision, and sentimentality is a kind of imprecision. She described him accurately, and what she described accurately was enough to make the loss of him plain without any ornament. She told me, one evening in the second year, that she had not known whether to trust me when I took the deed. She said she had trusted Orvanketh's judgment, and his judgment had been that I was the right person, and she had believed him, but trusting a person second-hand through someone else's certainty was not the same as trusting them from your own knowledge. I asked when she had started trusting me from her own knowledge. She said when you asked Oravel to stay, and then when you admitted you didn't know how to water a herd, in that order. I asked her why those two things. She said, the first one told me you understood that the estate was people, not just land. The second one told me you weren't going to pretend. I thought about that for a while. It seemed like a reasonable standard. Soval came back to the estate at the end of the first full season. She had been completing her compact educational exchange at the regional academic center when her father died, and she had returned for the Velasan period and then gone back to finish the term. When she came home for the season break, she was 20 Federation Standard years old, and she moved through the estate with a quality of quiet ownership that was different from grief and different from entitlement, and was something I could only describe as the knowledge of a place you were born in. She found me on the third morning of her return, standing in the upper field looking at the soil tier markers I had reset after the wet season runoff shifted two of the eastern lines. She stood beside me and looked at the markers. She asked, "Did you move the tertiary line 3 meters south?" I said I had. I explained the runoff pattern. She said, "My father moved it north 2 meters in my 5th season, and then south 3 meters in my 12th. The underlying drainage gradient runs south on a 14-year cycle. It will want to go back north in about 2 seasons." I said I didn't know that. She said it's in the estate log, the handwritten one, not the digital record. He kept 2 sets. I said I hadn't known about the handwritten one. She said, "I'll show you." She showed me the handwritten log that evening, a long series of notebooks in a cedar chest in the study, 40 years of Orvanketh's observations, written in the same careful highland script as the deed, covering every seasonal variation and anomaly and decision point in the estate's management. The earliest notebooks were from before Soval was born, from the years when Orvanketh had first taken over the estate from his own father, and they had the quality of a man learning to pay attention, shorter entries, more questions than conclusions, corrections made in different ink where he had returned to revise what he had written. The later notebooks were denser, the entries longer and more certain, the corrections rarer. The last notebook, the one that covered the season before his death, ended mid-entry, the last line incomplete. He had been writing about the southern field line drainage, which is where I had been standing that morning when Soval found me. It was, I understood as I turned the pages, a kind of letter, not addressed to me specifically. Addressed to whoever came next, whoever inherited the thing he had built and needed to understand how it worked. I said, "He kept this for 40 years and never mentioned it." Soval said, He mentioned it to me. He said someday it would be useful to the right person. I did not say anything for a moment. She said he was right about most things. I said he was right about most things. She sat down across from me at the study table with the easy ownership of someone in her own house, which she was, and she opened the notebook to the first entry and she began to explain it to me. She talked for 2 hours. She had her father's quality of explanation, not simplified, not condescending, just clear and thorough and genuinely interested in whether you understood. I took notes. When she asked, toward the end of the second hour, whether I had questions, I asked 6, and she answered all 6 with the same focused attention she had given the survey charts when she was 9 years old and had stood beside the table in the study, and asked what the third column meant. I thought about that later, after she had gone to bed and I was sitting alone in the study with the notebook stacked beside me. I thought about what Orvanketh had done, and why, and whether he had known what he was making possible when he put my name on the deed. I think he did. Not because he had planned it out with the kind of careful contingency that a strategic mind deploys. He was not that kind of person. He was the kind of person who watched things carefully over time and then acted from what he saw, and what he had seen over 11 seasons was this: that the estate was not just land, and it was not just the people on it, and it was not just the law that governed it or the succession rules that surrounded it. It was a thing that needed someone who understood all of those pieces and could hold them together without forcing them into a shape they did not want to take. And he had looked at the options available to him, and he had looked at the human who came to his plateau once a year, and asked about the horizon and ate at his table, and walked his field lines and talked with his wife and his daughter, and took notes in good faith, and didn't simplify what he already knew, and he had made a decision. I think he also knew something about what Varketh Isan and Soval would need. Not material security alone, though that was part of it. Something harder to name than material security. They needed someone who would treat the estate as a living thing to be tended rather than a problem to be solved. Someone who would sit at the stone table and eat dinner and argue about water rights precedent and ask Oravel to stay and admit he did not know how to water a herd. Someone whose name in the lower right corner of the deed was not an endpoint but a beginning. He had bet everything on the idea that I was that person. I have thought a great deal in the 2 years since his death about whether I have been. I do not have a clean answer. I have made mistakes. I have learned things slowly that I should have learned faster. I have not always said the right thing to Varketh Isan in the evenings at the stone table, and there have been conversations about Orvanketh that I handled clumsily, and there have been decisions about the estate that I got wrong on the first try and had to revisit. But I have been present. I have shown up every morning and walked the field lines and eaten the meals and read the notebooks and asked Soval about the drainage gradient, and listened to Oravel about the herd's wet season watering patterns, and sat at the stone table after dinner with Varketh Isan, and talked about the things that needed talking about. And I have not pretended to know things I do not know, and I have not made the estate into something other than what it was. The trust that Varketh Isan spoke about, when she told me her husband had registered the deed, when she said I should know the council would come. I did not understand it then as a thing she was giving me alongside a thing she was reporting. I thought she meant that Orvanketh had trusted me. I understood later that she was also telling me that she was prepared to trust me, and that this was a different thing and in some ways harder, because his trust had been built over 11 years, and hers had to be built from the moment she handed me that scroll. She trusts me now. She does not say so directly, because the Velketh do not say things directly that they consider to be obvious. But she pours 2 cups of the dark grain tea in the morning and sets one on my side of the table, which is the thing Orvanketh used to do, and she did not do it in the first year and she began doing it in the second year, and I know what it means. Soval, for her part, has taken a position as a compact land law consultant based partly out of the estate and partly out of the regional center. She is working on the question of how Compact Accord Article 22 interacts with clan bond land law across the various Velketh territorial branches, which is, I am told, a genuinely important and contested area of compact law. She has a particular interest in cases where the standard clan bond instruments have been used to override legitimate transfer deeds on the grounds of recipient status. She has not said explicitly that her interest in this question began with what happened at the estate after her father died. She has not needed to say so. I retired from the Corps at the end of my 43rd year. The retirement paperwork asked for a permanent address. I wrote down the estate's compact registry coordinates. It is the 45th year now. The plateau mornings are the same, that amber and dash light, long and level across the fields, and the stone table is the same. And the grain tea is the same dark color that Orvanketh used to set in front of me on the first morning of every assessment visit. And I sit at it every morning, and I look at the upper fields through the window where Varketh Isan stood the evening I arrived after his death, and I think about what an unusual thing it is to be trusted. Not because you asked for it, not because you are the obvious choice or the expected one, or the one the law would have designated, but because someone watched you carefully over a long time and decided that you were the person who would show up, and then registered that decision in a compact archive with 2 witnesses and a blotch of ink in the lower right corner where a hand pressed too hard. I have walked those field lines more times than I can count now. I know where the saltier markers want to shift after a wet season. I know the herd's watering patterns, and I know which notebook in the cedar chest covers the dry season years, and I know, when the upper fields go that particular color in the 4th month, that the planting rotation Orvanketh designed for this plateau is working the way he intended it to work. The deed is still in the study, in the cedar chest with the notebooks, pressed flat between 2 boards the way the Highland Velketh store important documents. I looked at it this morning. My name is still in the lower right corner in his careful script, and the ink is still slightly blotched where his hand pressed hard, and I still cannot read most of the Velketh above it, but I have been learning. I will get there eventually. He would have thought that was the right approach.